Bree. How are you?
Instagram. I'm good. I'm good, Lynette. How you doing?
Good. So glad our technology is working today, and that we can finally talk about your book.
Excellent. I've been dying to talk about my book. It came out on the 20th, and this is my first time talking about it, so I'm so excited for this invitation.
Well, we're very honored that you're speaking first about it here on Busch Hall, and I should remind everyone that Busch Hall is our virtual space to reimagine art and identity through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and it is generously supported by our German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, like so much else that we do at the museum, and so we're very grateful for their support. I also, before we begin, would like to acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. So as I mentioned, our guest today is Briana J. Smith, and Bree, you are the Assistant Director of Studies and Lecturer in the Committee on Degrees in History and Literature at Harvard, which is a longer title even than mine. And you are a historian of modern Europe. Bree's teaching and research interests include 20th century Europe, modern Germany, the global Cold War, art and politics, media and technology and society, digital culture, and urban studies. Anything you'd like to add to that?
None other than I don't know why I'm part of a committee on degrees rather than a department. This is one of these Harvard quirks of having an alternative name for all sorts of things. But thank you for the introduction, and I think that encompasses my range of interests quite well.
And as you mentioned, your book just came out. It's called Free Berlin, Art, Urban Politics, and Everyday Life. And we do have, oh, fantastic. We also have a link in our bio for anyone who wants to check out a longer description of Bree's book and hopefully place an order for it. So I'm hoping, Bree, we can just start out actually by you giving us just a sense of what your book is about and what you chose to focus on.
Yeah, excellent. So this book starts with the question of this bizarre entity, which is divided Cold War Berlin, located 100 miles behind the Iron Curtain, with East Germany and the East German capital of East Berlin, and West Berlin as this strange entity that is part of West Germany, but divided from it, separate from it, and after 1961, surrounded by the Berlin Wall. And so what I discovered was this kind of unlikely laboratory that developed in this space of divided Cold War Berlin, in which artists in particular found a space to experiment with uses for art outside of kind of the traditional venues for art in gallery and museum. And part of this was the result of West Berlin being a kind of unfavorable space for the art market to develop, being removed from West Germany, and the unique space of state socialist East Germany, where the state was doing all it could to kind of control what art looked like, the purposes it was serving, and yet artists in East and West kind of using this space, this anomalous space of divided Berlin, to pursue other uses for art. And what I see in particular, and what got me into this project, was artists particularly looking for ways to integrate art into everyday spaces, urban space, and kind of integrate it into different facets of social life. Now, what interested me with this book as well was that once I kind of discovered these artists in my research, was to track what they were up to after the wall comes down in '89 and Berlin reunifies. And what I found was some really interesting continuities in that a lot of these artists continue to, in fact, deepen their engagement in urban space, civic activism, and kind of repurposing these urban-oriented, community-oriented practices of the Cold War period towards activism, social movements on behalf of artists, but the citizens at large in the unified city. So I'm able to track this from kind of the late Cold War period up to I could say the present. We get as far as the fall elections of 2021. So very
well. At some point, you have to submit. At some point, you have to submit the manuscript, right?
Exactly. So this is like my last current event, fall 2021, and then this thing had to go to print. Yeah.
Well, it's one of the things, actually. I mean, that was one of the first things I noticed. Right, there's been a lot of work done on sort of recently on the final decade of the East German state and artists active at that time. But you really make a point of taking us past reunification, and I love the word you used, continuity, because it's also often something, we don't think quite as much about what that legacy is for, Berlin today. So maybe you could say a little bit more, because it feels to me like you almost start from this present moment or this present energy or certain things that we know about Berlin or we think we know about Berlin, and then you kind of, take us back to where those legacies maybe get started.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so for me, it was really, as a historian of modern Germany, it was really important to me to get to this moment of 89 and 90, the wall coming down and Germany reunifying in October of 1990, which often gets phrased as this great rupture.
Yeah.
And often this is where German histories end, essentially. And in fact, I found the most interesting stuff taking place even in this period between the wall opening in 89 and reunification, and in the kind of immediate years afterwards, that looked different from the narratives of this kind of happy ending of German reunification. One of the stories that comes out of this in-between period, where I'm kind of tracing the continuities of these practices, is in the organization of this Unhealable Germany demonstration that was staged just 1 month after the wall opens, that a group of artists from West Berlin, the Office for Unusual Events were their name, who were staging kind of urban political theater in West Berlin, carry this on 1 month after the wall opens, but invite artists and activists from East Berlin to join them in this joint East-West demonstration against what they see as the kind of lurking possibility of German reunification that was kind of in the air at the time. We can track this a little further into the 1990s, where you see East German artist Manfred Butzmann engaging in, actually, once again, joint East-West protests against rising rent costs on studio spaces, housing as well, in the early 1990s. And ways that they are, where you see this kind of red thread of their interest in engaging the larger community, engaging in a variety of spaces, being repurposed to these new types of actions and kind of civic engagement in the early 1990s.
I mean, available space for artists and affordable rents is, of course, something that artists and any resident of the Boston area can also relate to as well. So,
oh yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, well, I was going to say, and this is one of the issues that was very interesting when we're thinking about starting from where Berlin is today, where affordable housing, stop rental madness is the kind of hashtag that's used, is first and foremost among the issues of these kind of community groups, that I thought it was really helpful and important to point out this period in the early 1990s in which the same issue was coming up, and to kind of recover the ways in which artists had responded to the issue in the early 1990s.
And one of the things you do so well there is you also point out the way now, Berlin is marketed, and how we, as Americans in particular, I think about Berlin, right? So you're not going to go to Berlin and not check out the gallery scene, or you're going to go to the Berlin Biennale, or and that you sort of you look critically on that marketing of Berlin as kind of an artist city when you begin to track how artists have fought really for support throughout the last few decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a really interesting thing to come out of this, really this kind of marketing of Berlin as the creative city comes out of the early 2000s, in which Berlin was actually in great financial straits and in incredible debt. and trying to dig its way out of this debt and kind of remarket itself, that it picks up on this fact that there's a lot of artists here, there's a lot of culture industry folks here. This is something we can use to attract tourists. And this is very successful. And this is probably why a lot of, exactly as you kind of frame our connotations, our ideas of Berlin today, comes out of this very successful marketing campaign. But so what I found so interesting was that there are, in the 20-teens, artists in Berlin saying, recognizing how they're being used to promote tourism and saying, if we are going to be used in this way, we would like to see the city supporting us better as we are doing, you know, like serving this role for the city. How can the city support independent artists to sustain our work here? And groups actually looking towards tactics such as organizing, essentially, you know, artist interest groups that are going to be lobbying the Berlin Senat, the local government, that are going to be listing, kind of forwarding demands for what they want to see, which is, by and large, greater state support for independent artists. Subsidized studios, subsidies for projects, grants, supporting independent artist spaces, a variety of things you see there. And what I think is interesting about my book, bringing us some historical perspective, is that the key to understanding why West Berlin was such a kind of flourishing space for non-commercial art is that there was a really significant role played by the city government to support independent artists in West Berlin. That I think we can see a correlation here between local governments providing support for non-commercial art existing in kind of a range of spaces, being a key factor here.
Yeah, maybe you could say a little bit more about that too, because you referred to Berlin as a state of exception, you know, during the Cold War, and that influences a lot of, you know, what happens both during the Cold War and after. Maybe you could say a little bit more about how it is a state of exception.
Absolutely. Let me talk a little bit more about West Berlin, because West Berlin is so fascinating. So, and the role of culture in West Berlin in particular. Once the wall goes up in West Berlin in 1961, this is not a place a lot of folks want to live. There's a population exodus that continues through the 1970s of folks decamping for West Germany. This goes for employers as well, kind of like relocating to West Germany. But Berlin retains this really significant symbolic value in the Cold War, having been, you know, framed as this, quote, outpost of freedom, this island of democracy in the Red Sea. And so for West Germany, for the US as well, it's really important that West Berlin continue to kind of have this position of being a kind of thriving liberal democracy. And culture gets identified as the kind of key site in which West Berlin can continue to kind of convince the world of this. And so what you're going to see is massive amounts of money coming from the federal government in Bonn to West Berlin to support arts and cultural programming. And in particular, West Berlin looks to support experimental work, avant-garde artists coming in from the US, from West Germany, from abroad, to kind of drum up this reputation of West Berlin as being not provincial, but on the kind of cutting edge of arts and culture. And this goes into play to have this kind of large cultural budget that the local government is using for, you know, more kind of high cultural offerings, but also down to creating what they called the Free Seeing Fund in 1979, which is grants for experimental work from all artistic genres, works of art that perhaps don't have any, you know, like more kind of traditional venue, but to support just this kind of ecosystem of experimentation that ties directly to this effort to kind of bolster West Berlin in this kind of larger Cold War picture.
So what happens to that after
Exactly. Great question. Early 1990s is a really, really challenging time for East and West Berliners because the state support falls away. And that's a good thing to remember here too. East German artists too were reliant on high subsidies from the state for studios, for travel, all sorts of things. So the Free Scene Fund that had helped out West Berlin artists, that's gone in the early 90s, and rents are going up.
Yeah. So
this is a very challenging time for folks who had kind of set up their lives to kind of prioritize art making with the ability to rely on a low cost of living and state support. And I think this is what kind of encourages folks to kind of continue to seek I think people keep kind of pointing back to the memory of this period pre-unification and what was possible then. I think that seeds this ongoing kind of return to the call for state support in the 21st century.
Right, and it's interesting though, because from an American perspective, we think of Germany as a place where there is a lot of state support for arts and culture. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's interesting when you dig in, right, and you see, see the details of that. I mean, I think, the certainly the rent protests and the rising costs around just living in Berlin, which are very different than, 20 odd years ago, have reached us here as well. You say in the book, actually, and I really like this, I found it really helpful. You said, while West Berlin is easily mythologized, East Berlin is oversimplified. So could we move now to East Berlin as well?
I would love to. And actually, I'd say the clues that I started to encounter early on in the research that East Germany was oversimplified is really kind of what drew me into this project. Having started to do research on art and culture in East Germany, all that I was reading was telling me that the ruling Socialist Unity Party had, kind of complete control over official art, and art that appeared in any sort of state-sponsored space is going to be censored. It is going to be following the kind of guidelines of socialist art known as socialist realism. Mm-hmm. And I encountered one innocent photograph of some wild performance art happening in East Berlin in the 1980s. And that photograph really kind of shook me. A glitch in the matrix, I'll say that, like, wait a second, like everything I'm reading is telling me that this can't exist in East Berlin. This little clue is suggesting something else. And in fact, the more I dug into the research, the more surprised I was how easy it was for me to find archival evidence of a much more nuanced art world across the GDR, and ways in which artists were finding ways to essentially kind of work within the system, but take advantage of ways in which they could kind of stretch it and push beyond the kind of more formal boundaries. And one place where I really was surprised to see a lot of interesting work happening was at small neighborhood galleries. These are run by the city rather than by the larger artist association. But so they're still, like city state-sponsored spaces. They are not what we would call underground spaces. Nevertheless, since they are happening at the peripheries of the city, you see a lot of more kind of experimental work happening there, artists finding ways to use these spaces to bring together groups of people to encounter work that may be more challenging than what they're used to in other types of spaces. And I also see artists doing this in other ways in which they are once again working kind of within the system, but pursuing ways of kind of rethinking ways in which socialist citizens could engage in society in a much more nuanced way than what I was seeing in the literature. But I think the key to kind of parsing this out was to breaking down this binary of official versus unofficial and identifying this kind of gray area in between that artists are really kind of exploiting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that leads me to the question. So I was talking actually recently to an art historian who works quite a bit on East German art and specifically on painting, and that she's been talking to a number of artists, from former East Germany who are still, living and working in Germany today, and they felt that the emphasis in recent scholarship specifically, and I'm not targeting you here with this critique, but maybe a little bit, that this American focus like yours on, say, grassroots activism or sort of art outside of, you know, sort of kind of official structures, that focus on art, sort of experimental art, is actually kind of skewing the historical record. So you called it a kind of glitch in the matrix. So, you know, are we, Bri, making too much of the glitch in the matrix, or what?
That's a fair critique, and I've really enjoyed where a lot of work is going on East German painting as well, work from April Eisman in particular, that I think is also doing a great job of kind of identifying the ways in which even, you know, these quote unquote official artists are doing a lot more with socialist realism than we often acknowledge. But to my point, and to the point about all this work coming out, identifying experimental work happening in East Germany, and whether this is a kind of tangential piece of a different history, I think this is really important, really to help us better understand art and culture in East Germany and the range of practices that were possible, but also for me in particular, the ways in which art, whether it be an exhibition at a small neighborhood gallery or a photo montage poster that shows up at a bookstore, ways in which art is used to kind of forge communities outside of kind of state-sponsored rituals, let's say, in public space, and to kind of bring folks together under a different set of concerns or issues that I think allows for this space to open up for a different type of kind of civic engagement in the GDR. And this is what is particularly interesting to me about the ways in which I see some of this artwork functioning, that it kind of ties to larger questions of East German society, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s.
And I think there it's important to mention for our audience that it's not that sort of major art world figures are wholly absent from your book. So you look, for example, I mean, as the curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, I have to mention, you know, the work of Joseph Beuys, and you do talk about his legacy. So maybe you could say a little bit more, although you're focusing on, you know, sort of what you yourself call the fringe, right? You are also showing the ways in which these other, you know, artists, as we do tend to know them, have impacted that trajectory as well.
Absolutely, and that's such a great point, and I'm so glad you bring up Beuys, in that as I tried to draw parallels between artists in East and West, and in this temporal divide of 89, post-89, Beuys is there through all of it. An interest in Beuys's ideas about the ways in which art could be used to help, you know, like motor, kind of generate social change, and access to art and involvement in social change beyond artist circles, was something that really interested the folks I'm looking at in West Berlin, was of extreme interest to the East German artists, many of whom kind of already viewed the work that they did as socialist artists as kind of falling within Joseph Beuys's idea of the social sculpture. And then we see this continue after '89 as artists at times start to call themselves cultural workers and start engaging in larger, kind of broader coalitions in which artists, urban activists, intellectuals are forming these kind of larger networks. One great example is the Inner City Action Network that formed in the mid to late 1990s, that actually formed across German-speaking Central Europe, but in Berlin, in which artists are joining with all these other groups to address a series of kind of issues facing the city at the time. And I think this idea of art and social engagement from Beuys, you see it running through there and continuing into the 21st century. The one thing I'll name real quick here that I see like a real incredible resonance is the 2014 Tempelhof Field Initiative, in which the Citizens Initiative formed to essentially take a vote of whether or not the city should be developing part of the Tempelhof field. This is a former airport turned massive public green space. And
it's wonderful. I mean, it's wonderful.
It's an amazing place. Yeah. Right? No, it's an incredible place. And the voters of Berlin voted down the city's proposal to develop part of this field, said 100% should remain open and accessible. And this vote in particular reminded me of actually Boyce's own ideas in the 1970s, citing the importance of the citizens' initiative, this kind of direct democracy as the kind of ultimate expression of the social sculpture. So to me, to trace the way we see art and politics kind of weaving together here, that Tempelhof vote and Tempelhof remaining what it is today is just like such an incredible example of how Boyce kind of runs through all of this.
I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me about your book, and didn't maybe surprise me quite so much because we had met briefly in person before, but there is an incredible optimism and positivity in your writing, which, you know, I think, yes, you know, urban space has the potential to challenge corporate or state power, but it's not always a site of collaboration and participation. And you dedicate your book to, quote, the free cities of your youth and the people you met there. And I just want to know, Bri, are you hopeful for the free cities of the future?
Oh, Lynette, that's great that you pick up. I mean, that you pick up on this aspect of the book. And I guess in light of the fact that you've noticed this tone to the book, do I remain hopeful? I do. And I think every time I visit Berlin, this is renewed by what I see there, and the ways in which my own experiences in Berlin and kind of tracking what's happening there today kind of goes against a lot of the very kind of pessimistic outlooks on urban politics today, on urban living today, and a lot of the kind of scholarly tracks that are kind of this very kind of pessimistic take on neoliberal 21st century life, and the types of organizing, the kind of spirit of collaboration and the commitment to this alternative vision that to me that is alive and well in Berlin. You know, even responding to a series of challenges that gives me great hope. And to you know, run into folks in the United States who have a similar commitment and engagement, that this extends beyond Berlin. And that is why I did want to kind of point beyond Berlin to other spaces in my dedication, and certainly, you know, like the cities, the Midwestern cities that I know very well from my youth, as I stated in the dedication, where I saw a lot of this taking place as well.
I'm a Midwesterner too, so.
Oh my gosh, that's so great to hear. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, Lynette.
Well, this has been so wonderful, and we're already at our time, but I want to thank you so much, Bri, for this very engaging and in-depth peek at your book. And I just want to encourage everyone to check out Bri's new book, Free Berlin, out now, and really a wonderful, very new, I mean, I learned so much, Bri, about, not just about Berlin, but about the history of Germany and post-wall from your book. So I'm very grateful. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in, and see you next time on Busch Hall Conversations.
Thanks so much, Lynette, and thanks everyone for joining in. It was such a pleasure to join, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, Bri.
Bye, Lynette.